here with the group. The seminar will start at 4:30 rather than 4. So just hang on there so you can be there. So happy to take any other question that you have now. Any other questions someone might have? Un punto importante anterior es que el profesor Meyer dice que hay como una especie de centro de atención en cuanto que Israel propiciaría guerra cuando en realidad una sola. Mientras que hay mucho menor atención cuando otras potencias, como las ya citadas, generan más bien matanzas y hay poca repercusión en los medios. Pasa desapercibida crímenes de guerra, también hay personas inocentes envueltas, y entonces se toma conciencia de, por lo menos, notar este contraste, la atención mediática que se da a ciertos eventos en la actualidad. I can only answer in more general terms because, of course, the Torah doesn't talk about Christianity or Muslim. It's a question of timeline. So the Torah essentially divides the world into two categories, either the children of Israel or in its time. And again, I mean, when I say that, I'm just going back to the kind of the pre-children of Israel sort of time, like the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, on one hand, and idolatry on the other hand. So, of course, the texts of the Torah are very harsh against idolaters. The text of the Torah considers that you don't have a sufficient amount of osmosis of values between the starting religion of the children of Israel and the idolaters to envisage a life together. This is the story of technically Abraham, who is leaving idolatry and he's trying to establish something else. The reality is that it's a little bit more complicated because you see that even after Abraham has kind of separated, indicating that you can't really have religion, then Abraham starts to have negotiation with the kings that are around, which of course are kings of idolatry. So from that point of view, the text of the Torah says something, but it also defeats its own saying. Like, you can't really have that, but in reality, you do have that. And that is a leitmotif that you find in the biblical narrative as you go through the different books. if you take it, which I think is more interesting, now you leave the Torah aside because it's too old to a certain degree, and you take it to the rabbinic tradition. How does the rabbinic tradition envisage to work and to the possibility of functioning with other religious tradition? And here in particular, you have Christianity and Islam who are starting to take an important role. For many centuries, more or less until the 14th century, Christianity, according to Judaism, was considered as an idolatry because of the Trinity, because of the figure, because of the drawings, because of the face, and all that is, of course, prohibited by the Jewish understanding of Torah. This has to be read, of course, in light of the fact that Christianity, who had the power, rejected the Jews on the complete margin of society. So it's difficult to know exactly who, how, where you put the cursor in this part. But what is interesting is that in the 14th century, which is kind of quite early in a way, came some Jewish scholars, rabbinic scholars, who made the following statements. They said, even though we don't really understand Christianity is not an idolatry. So they said the Trinity is something that we don't understand, and many Christians also have great difficulty with the Trinity. Of course, it's a complex topic, as you know. So we don't really understand, but it is not an idolatry. And therefore, it should not be treated in accordance to the laws of the Torah with regard to idolaters. And from that point onwards, of course, the relationship, and even before in reality, but the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and more so even with Islam in the Islamic lands, either in North Africa and so on, were real. They were existing. And Judaism was quite happy to find a sort of a modus vivendi with the non-Jewish religion. Not that Judaism had any choice, to find a modus vivendi to live with the other when you don't have a choice if you want to live with them or not is actually not that difficult. You just have to do it. Okay, it's not a problem. But theoretically, from the 14th century onward, Christianity was accepted by Jewish law as a proper, respectable religion with whom we can have normal relationship with no hindrance. And I say it's quite early because from the point of view of the church, it took quite a few more centuries to arrive that in the reciprocal view. It basically took until 1965, essentially. With Islam, it was easier because Islam didn't have images or Trinity. And so from that point of view, even though Islam was a text-based religion and had a text, the Quran, as a text that is a different text than, of course, the biblical text, but nevertheless, it was a revealed, it had the status of a revealed text, so there were more osmosis, if you want, between Judaism and Islam than there were at the beginning between Judaism and Christianity. So that hurdle didn't exist as much within Islamic land as it did in Christian land. Where Judaism has difficulty today, for some, I mean, not for me, but for some, is with the religions of the East, which, Hinduism, Buddhism, a lot of those religions, which I'm ashamed to say I'm not very familiar with and know very little about, but you have a lot of rabbinic voices who say we can't have relation with them. Not that we can't live with them, we do live with them, but we can't have religious exchange with them. So here there would still be a remnant, if you want, of the rules of idolatry in Torah that have some sort of implication today within that realm. But very few Jews will be concerned because Jews are mostly, Jews today are only in the Western world and in Israel. You don't have Jews in Muslim lands. I mean, don't forget the Arab countries have expelled all their Jews in 1956. Okay, so basically there's no more Jews in Islamic lands.
I'm sorry, going on that. What about the idea that Yahweh come from Ismail.
But
Does it make a sense, or all this?
no, it's a rabbinic typology. It's rabbinic Judaism loves to work on typological reading. So we read the story of the patriarch as being a prefiguration of whatever happens in history later. So, for example, Esau, became Edom, and then it becomes Rome, and by extension it becomes Christianity, and it becomes the whole of the West. And on the other side, Ishmael becomes Islam and the whole of the Islamic world. The text of the Torah is not a book of history. The Torah is not an history book. The Torah is a book of stories, not a book of history. So it's stories to make you think, but it's not stories to read history through them. So I think the question of saying that Islam would really be the descendant of Ishmael in concrete term is no less absurd than to say in concrete term that I'm a descendant of Jacob. I want to say that as a typological reading, but not as de facto reality. Yeah.
La Torah divide en dos categorías el mundo, judíos e idólatras. En el siglo XIV empieza esta división a fijarse con una apertura hacia los cristianos. Fue mucho más fácil tener una apertura previamente con los musulmanes, porque en el cristianismo existe el dogma de la Trinidad, imágenes que para los judíos les hacía difícil conciliar como una verdadera religión monoteísta. Esto, sin embargo, de parte de los cristianos, la apertura hacia los judíos fue mucho más tardío, no es hasta 1965, supongo, con los tratados del fruto del Concilio Vaticano II. La relación de los judíos con las demás religiones, especialmente la celeste, es mucho más compleja, pero no tan relevante porque de hecho no hay presencia de judíos en los países árabes o islámicos. Recordando que fueron ellos expulsados de esos países después de los conflictos que hubo.
Sí.
I can add. Just briefly, because you mentioned this challenge between Western, between these other religions from Orient, I want to ask, certain branches in Judaism are more familiar with the concept of reincarnation. Of course, this concept not come only from India or these areas. Also in ancient Greece, they have certain notions related with reincarnation or transmigration of
the souls.
soul.
Yeah.
Which is these branches in Judaism who accept these ideas? Because I know there is no specific notion about the afterlife. This is the great question.
Right. So what you're pointing towards is the fact that Judaism is not an homogeneous. It's not a coherent group of people. Okay, we have, like in many religious traditions, we kind of separate into smaller groups according to specificities, and so you do have all sorts of kinds of Jews, from very Orthodox Jews to less Orthodox to completely non-Orthodox to Reform Jews to liberal Jews to secular Jews, and to Jews who hate to be Jews, but who are Jews nevertheless. I mean, you have a whole gamut of things. So I think what you're pointing to in terms of those beliefs, they come from ancient tradition within Judaism, which I don't know the origin as such, but the people who would more in the kind of some of the more Hasidic spheres of Judaism from, let's say, the 16th, 17th century onwards, would claim that the origin is the mystical tradition that existed already, in fact, at the time of Jesus, to be fair, and that those ideas have stayed within Judaism as a kind of a slow burner level. They have been there. It's not something that you can completely dismiss, but it was very, very marginal in Judaism. This is not what was defining mainstream Judaism. Today, the situation has changed a little bit because the margin has had a tendency to become the norm. And a lot of those kinds of mystical, Kabbalistic sort of ideas from the side have now taken a little bit center stage, not so much in real Jewish life, but in popular Jewish life. And it's also because people like Madonna and others have contributed a great deal to make Judaism a fantasy and a ridiculous thing. And it has become a little bit of a fashion to, I mean, that was before the last few years, because today there's nothing fashionable about being a Jew, but a few years back it had become a little bit fashionable to say, you know, I'm not a Jew, but I do Kabbalah, or this is a Kabbalist Jew, or those kind of things. But, you know, normally those things are very marginal. But the people who do believe in it and who do have some knowledge about it, they would certainly argue that the history of this is not borrowed from the Eastern religion, but it's on the opposite, something that is coming from the historical experience of Judaism before the formation of the rabbinic standard of Judaism. Okay, but a lot of people think it's a little bit off the mark, and I'll just say, you know, Gershom Scholem, who was a very well-known writer on Jewish mysticism, and I can't remember who was the rector of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem at the time. That was before the creation of the state, I think, when Gershom Scholem made the inaugural lecture about Jewish mysticism. But the story goes that the rector introduced Gershom Scholem of saying, Gershom Scholem is going to talk, Professor Scholem is going to talk about Jewish mysticism. It is rubbish, but scholarship about rubbish is still scholarship. So, and then he said, you have the floor. You can talk what you want. No, it is nonsense. It is not. No, he didn't say rubbish. It is nonsense. But scholarship about nonsense is scholarship. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So what I'll do is we'll start with the seminar, which is where we were. I don't know exactly what's happening with you students at this thing, which they are very, very welcome. Yeah. Okay, so they can stay a bit at the beginning. No, it's lovely to have you. I'm very happy to have you, and I like to have a bit of contact with the student. It's very nice. Yeah. Okay, so let's do that, and then I'll sit here because I do need my computer for putting on the screen a few things. So, right. So, I'm just gonna I will start after the Exodus from Egypt. You're very brave. It's lovely. But you can go whenever you need to go. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Okay, so let's start restart the seminar. It's about the environment, the question of the environment through the lens of Jewish text. I just want to give a little summary of what we did yesterday. for those who were not here, and even for those who were here, it's gonna help a little bit. Yesterday we did a few things. First of all, we finished, if you remember, with the kind of introduction which was giving different starting point into the topic of the environment. And the one we ended with was the question of halakha and measurements, of saying it's interesting that the environment is all about measurement. I was pitching that against the need for a narrative that I did 2 days ago, but there is still an issue of measurement in Judaism, in the environment, and in Judaism, of course, there is a great emphasis on measurement because halakha is about measuring everything. So I said halakha can be useful as a religious perspective to the question of the environment. But in addition to that, if you remember, I talked about the double movement, the subjective experience, which becomes an halachic norm, and the halachic norm is a how do you do thing, and the point I was saying is how do you do things impact in return your subjective understanding of the event. So there is from the subjective to the objective, and the objective is going to reshape the subjective. And what I was attempting to say was that we can use that kind of double movement for the question of the environment, because in the environment there is also an how. And the example I was taking was to say, when we do the how, us as individual, the how of the environment that we know about is whether we're using plastic bottles or whether we separate the dustbins or those kinds of things. Are those how sufficient or not? And I don't think they are. But would they be sufficient in the meaning that they carry to sharpen my subjective understanding of the importance of the topic? So this kind of circular argument was one point that I was trying to make. So we looked at this passage, and then we started to look at the question of the human dominion. The dominion in question, of saying very often the religious tradition are the culprit of the attitude towards the environment, and we talk about it's all because of the Genesis narrative. You should have dominion over everything, and that creates the problem. And what I was trying to point out was that how do we think of dominion? And I know there are people who tackle the question of the environment by removing the ethnocentric lens, and I was trying to show the risk and the difficulty of imagining that we could do without ethnocentrism. And for that, we use the text, if you want, of Soloveitchik, who was talking about human dignity. Human dignity means human dominion, and the reason he was saying, why is dominion needed? Because this is the only way you have responsibility. You don't have responsibility if you don't have power. So if you remove the question of the dominion, you remove the question of responsibility, and if you remove the question of responsibility, there's nothing real you do. So Soloveitchik was one of the voices we looked at. I don't want to come back to that. I then looked at some alternative reading. You remember Nachmanides in the early Middle Age, who was trying to read the holiness as being self-restrained into what is permitted. I'm saying it's not a question of power. There's a sense of responsibility in knowing what is to be self-restrained in what's allowed. So dominion is allowed, but do we know how to be self-restrained in dominion? And he said that, for him, is a definition of holiness. So I thought that was a kind of an interesting take. I contrasted that with the document from the Vatican that also talks about human dignity, but doesn't give a precise definition of it. And what I was saying is we have to be careful of terminology. If we only talk about words, but concepts, but we don't give content to the concept, we might end up in trouble. And we looked lastly at, almost lastly, at the question, the text of Katz, if you remember, Eric Katz, I think was his full name, ecocide and genocide. What do we learn from the dominion of nature? And he was taking as a starting point the pictures in the concentration camp, the picture in the Warsaw Ghetto, when it all looks peaceful and beautiful. He said there's something unreal about the site of death are becoming the site of natural beauty. And he said the juxtaposition of the two is very difficult to take. And what he was kind of arguing is, in fact, let me show you what nature does when nature is left unchecked. Nature recaptures, nature is recapturing a domain, and nature is taking dominion. He was calling that nature's imperialism. And what he wanted to do, because he's an environmentalist, what he wanted to do was not to say that nature is terrifying because look at what they do to the sites of memory. What he wanted to say is, let me show you what imperialism is. So nature's imperialism. What nature can't do is restrain. Now that you understand what is unrestrained imperialism, that kind of covers up your history and imposes its own image on your history up to the point where you disappear, now you understand what you do when you use your imperialism over nature. He said the difference between the two is that you have the possibility of self-restraint, which nature doesn't. So he's using the reverse image in order to bring you back to what you be and should be attentive to. So that was kind of what he did. And then we asked one last question yesterday, which was, how do we learn? What's the practicality of that self-restraint? How does that work? And I went back to Soloveitchik with, again, the book called Isha Halacha, The Man of Halacha, and in which he said the halachic man comes with an ideal view. He has an ideal view of the world, and when he comes and stumbles upon nature, upon the real world, his only interest is to know, is the real world fitting into my ideal world? And what was interesting in this is that when it doesn't, then halachic man walks away and he leaves nature by itself. So he said, he look at a mountain, he look at a river, and he's looking at the river and he say, is that a ritual bath? And if it's not an halachic ritual bath, then he moves away and he leaves nature alone. But that is only possible if you have a mental image of how the world should be rather than how the world is. So the view of Soloveitchik was kind of helpful somehow to try to see how, in a very particular way, but how can it be somehow that at some stage you control your desire to have dominion. So halacha was an example of how it could be. Now, I want to continue with what's on the board, and the reason I'm doing this is because in the article of Katz, we didn't have time to do it, but I'll just sum that up. In the article of Katz, he was also saying that when nature heals history, like the picture of the beautiful meadow in the Majdanek concentration camp, he said this is not, nature has changed the nature of the site. This is not what was in this site. This was a site of mass murder, and now it's a beautiful site. But the beautiful site is not what it was. And he said we have to be aware that when we repair nature, just like can nature repair history, when we repair nature, whatever we repair is not what nature would have been. Nature unchecked is not a repaired nature. So the question, and I'm just using that without going into the details because I want to go to this text, is what about, since we stick with a certain degree with the question of dominion, ethnocentrism, with restriction, with responsibility, with resistance, but since we have that, what are we making of the question of reparation? How do we repair what we've damaged? So I want to start with a little text here from the prophet Isaiah. It's a very well-known passage. You have it here. Shout it aloud, do not hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendant of Jacob their sins. Day after day they seek me out. As the generation go, we are getting worse and worse and worse, and okay, it's like this. But even if we're getting worse and worse and worse, which is not so unfamiliar to what we do to nature as well, it's getting, the more we pollute, the more we do this, the more we need, all of that. Then at some stage comes the tricky part here, which is on verse, it is on verse 11, and it starts from verse 11 onwards. The Lord your God, so you have it there, the Lord your God will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden. So it's a scorched out land, but somehow the Eternal will make it all better and it's going to become again pleasant. Like a spring whose water never fell. And verse 12, the most problematic. Your people will rebuild the ancient ruins and will raise up against the age-old foundations. You will be called repairers of broken walls. Okay? Restorers of streets with dwellings. And I'm interested in this text because the question it really asks is, can we repair everything? Isaiah seems to consider that even the scorched land will be repaired into a beautiful thing with the water and so on. You will be called repairers of damages, repairers of broken walls. Is that what we meant to be? To repair everything that we have broken? And can we always repair what we have broken? And this is, of course, a real question in the ecological debate, because even when we are aware of the consequence of the catastrophe, there is always the question, is it too late, is it not too late? You know, can we repair, can we not repair? And if we can repair anything, if we are repairers of walls, as the biblical tradition teaches us, then let's just carry on, because they're going to be able to repair. So what's the deal? So the quote is actually a bit difficult from that point of view. But I wanted to start with that, and then to show a contradictory view, of course, of this, which is the Midrash Ecclesiastes Rabbah. So it's a rabbinic commentary to the book of Ecclesiastes. When God created the first human being, God led them around all the trees of the Garden of Eden, and he said, look at my works. See how beautiful they are, how excellent. For your sake I created them all. See to it that you do not spoil and destroy my world, for if you do, there will be no one else to repair it. So here you suddenly have the rabbis taking the opposite view than the prophet Isaiah. It's like, yeah, there's a moment where if you spoil the whole thing and you've destroyed the whole thing, then it is not repairable. And there will be nobody left to repair. So our ecological concern, our environmental concern, almost kind of hesitate between the two. Okay? Now, I want to do that to introduce something that's a little bit more difficult, which is the first text here. Which is this notion, what is the notion of repairing the world? Because there is such a notion in Judaism, it's called tikkun olam. Okay? That's where you have a focus on tikkun olam. Tikkun olam is the ability to letaken, is to repair, and olam is the world. We can repair the world. But I thought it would be interesting to see what is really the meaning of tikkun olam. How does that work? And here you see it's a bit difficult. So it's talking about a divorce bill. It's about divorce. That's the first time the notion appears. Okay? The Mishnah, 2nd century, relates that initially a husband who wished to render the bill of divorce void would convene a court, so a rabbinic tribunal, elsewhere, and render the bill of divorce void in the presence of the court before it reached his wife. So, what case are we talking about? It's a husband who wants to divorce his wife. He has to write a bill of divorce. But somehow he changed his mind. So he writes a bill of divorce, but he changed his mind. Either because he's made up with his wife, or who knows, he doesn't want anymore, but he's already written the bill of divorce. Can he repair? So he said, initially, he would go to another city, and he would render the bill of divorce void in the presence of the court before it reached the wife, because if the first bill of divorce reached the wife, she's divorced. Okay? So there was a way. Rabban Gamliel, however, a very famous name, the elder, instituted an ordinance, or a decree, that one should not do this because of the betterment of the world. So here the betterment is l'etikkun olam, is to the reparation of the world. It's not really betterment of the world. Now why? Why you shouldn't do that? Why would you not be able to give a second chance to that couple and say, okay, you can stay married. You've written a bill of divorce, but you've patched up together. Why would I say, no, you can't cancel that bill of divorce? So the Gemara will explain what this means. So you see in the text, of course, everything that's in bold is what's the Hebrew, and everything that's not in bold is what the editor adds to kind of give it some sense. So the Gemara will explain what this means. So initially, the husband would change his name and her name from the name by which they were known, where they were formerly lived, to the names by which they were known, where the bill of divorce was written, and write the name of his city and the name of her city. So they are playing tricks to cancel the bill by kind of changing the name or the name of the city. One was not required to list all of the name by which the husband and the wife were known, but only the name of the place where the bill of divorce has been written. But Rabban Gamliel the elder instituted that the scribe should write in the bill of divorce that this man called so-and-so, and any other name that he has, and you list them, and the woman so-and-so, or any other name that she has. And the reason for that is for the reparation of the world, the betterment of the world, as perhaps the people of a different city would not recognize the name written in the bill of divorce and would claim that this bill of divorce does not belong to her. So, in short, why is this interesting? It's interesting because it's about, can I repair something that I've done? Something happened between that man and that woman. They decide to divorce. So you can repair, in a way, the marriage that kind of has collapsed. But somehow it hasn't completely collapsed, so you want to repair what you had tried to repair already by saying, I'm going to cancel the first bill of divorce. And the rabbi comes and he said, no, you can't do that. You can't repair what you think was already broken that you had repaired the first time. And the issue here is, what happens if you don't do that? Well, what happens if you don't do that is you can always repair. You think you can always repair. You think you can always change. I've done this, but now I change my mind, but I change my mind again, and then I can change my mind again, and I can keep changing my mind. And Rabban Gamliel comes and says, no, the world doesn't function like this. You're given a chance or two, you're not given 20 chances. So there's a moment where reparation of the world stops working. And here Rabban Gamliel says, actually, for the fact that the world should continue to function as it does, you need to accept that you can't always repair. If you think that you can repair all the time, you're creating a dynamic of perpetual destruction. And so the view here is, we are a people in a position of dominion. Does dominion means that I can believe in repairing? Only at the very beginning. But the world does not function if you keep thinking that everything is repairable. Not everything is repairable. So that's kind of how the way managed that. I thought it was kind of interesting to finish this passage on dominion with that. Any question on this, maybe? So he was trying to kind of change the names or not given exactly the name of the city so that... Yes, exactly. It is also in the contract of marriage. Yeah. So, it's just to say here, just to show that there's a kind of a limit to this idea that you can repair things. And I think you can technically marry 20 times. Yes, you can. But you have to divorce each time a different wife. But you can't keep pretending that you've repaired your mistake. So yes, you can divorce 20 times in Judaism. You can divorce as many times as you want, in fact. As long as it's not just about this kind of constant hesitation. I damage, but I can repair. If I can repair, I can re-damage, but I can re-repair, and so on and so forth. So it's just this, you're creating a dynamic which, in fact, rather than repairing the world, contribute to the destruction of the world. So the idea of the infinite reparation, the infinite tikkun olam, doesn't work.
Sorry for the question. It's related with the concept of the time, because we are thinking in a line, but another cultures are thinking in a circle, and this dynamic of redemption.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, we're thinking in the line of the real life in which we live. Yeah. That effectively doesn't take into account any sort of idea of a more eschatological perception. But again, I mean, this is because Judaism is kind of a religion of the here and now. So from that point of view, yes, the structure of time here is not exactly a linear line. It's more a spiral because it goes week after week on the 0 point of Shabbat, but it keeps moving. It's not something that's kind of returning. Yeah. Right. So this was just to finish the first part on dominion. I just wanted to add this little bit. And what I want to do now is I want to turn to the kind of the second topic, which was sort of a provocative question that I wanted to address, and the question of environment brings us to this idea that we are all facing the same destiny. And very often when we talk about the environmental question, the issue is, as I said before, we're all in the same boat. I mean, we're in it, and therefore we have to think globally. The provocative question I had was, is that the case? Are we all concerned, or are we not all concerned? And if we are all concerned by a global threat, what is the risk of a theological thinking that puts the emphasis on the globality of a threat? And in order to do that, I would like to start with two biblical stories, which are very well known, and at the same time, they have their own complications, because there are only two stories that really talk about humanity as a global entity in front of threat and destruction. One is the flood, the other one is the story of the Tower of Babel. Okay, so the story of the flood, we know it here, but it has, as I said, it has its difficulty. So I would like us just to read it quickly. Try to make that a bit bigger if I can. Yeah. So when human being increased, okay, when human being began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God, whoever those are, which we don't really know, saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. So, of course, one of the discussion we had yesterday was the question of increase. Okay, the question of the environment is highly related to population. Okay, of course, in small groups, in small entity, when there's no increase of number, the question of being provided by whatever the earth produces is not so much of an issue. The question is, okay, we're living in big cities, and it's more complicated than that. So it starts when the numbers increase, and the earth and the daughters were born to them, and the sons of God, which, as I said, we don't know who they are, they thought that the daughters of human were beautiful, and they wanted to marry anyone they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit will not contend with human forever, for they are mortals. Their days will be 120 years. What do we make of the beginning if we don't want to take it as a myth? If we take it as a myth, then okay, we leave it with the sons of God, and the sons of God wanted to have sexual relationship with the woman, and okay, that was the beginning of the end. But if we don't take it as a myth, and we want to try to read something into it, what eventually would we say? What is the story really about? Well, it's about two things, or three. One, the increase that we've mentioned. Two, it's about the fact that humanity has produced things which are beautiful, desirable. It's about beauty and desire. It's too simple to say we've only done horrible things and look at what humans do. At the end of the day, even the sons of God thinks that what we've done is not so bad. It's beautiful, it's desirable. But it's also about crossing of boundaries. You know, there's kind of boundaries that are crossed between whatever those sons of God who decide. So it's just like worlds that are supposed to be maybe separated, then somehow are not separated any longer. So somehow it starts to have a connotation that's more interesting than just a mythological teaching. And then it goes on, it said, the Nephilim, so those who had fallen, were on the earth in those days and also afterwards when the Son of God went to the daughter of the human and had children by them. It's so good that they want to increase and continue to increase, and there's more and more production, and there's more and more beautiful things that humanity produce, and it's so beautiful that it attracts all sorts of things. They were the heroes of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth. And you see the contrast, that somehow everything is beautiful, and then suddenly you say how wicked we are. So where is the wickedness? There is something that is this wickedness that appears, which we don't know where it's coming from. We were just told that it's beautiful, and they were just told that all those were heroes of old, men of renown. I mean, what's the issue? So somehow, in the midst of the beauty of everything we've done, there is something that is problematic. And that suddenly appears as problematic, but that is not so problematic in itself. We've created all sorts of things as humanity. And we can't just say, well, everything we've created brings its own downfall. It's very attractive, it's very beautiful, it's very desirable. And yet, if you have another look at it from a different angle, so here, through the image of the divine angle, there's something problematic within that beauty. And I think it's nice because it brings complexity to the question that we face when we look at the question of the environment and everything we do, the pollution and so on and so forth. You know, we can shout against the pollution and so on, but there are beautiful things that we've done. Okay? Yes, the pollution has its negative side, of course we know that, but at the same time there are things that are beautiful. There are things that are desirable. Remember Soloveitchik yesterday, who said it's part of the human glory to be able to travel from from New York to London overnight. He said this is part of human's glory. Don't tell me this is not glorious. Of course, it creates it damages the ozone, but it's still beautiful. So the story has that complexity, which makes it real suddenly, rather than just a theoretical approach. So the Nephilim, we don't really know again who they are. They're a little bit like those divine kind of half beings who decide that they marry the daughters of humans and create something with them. It's again the question of, I think there's something about boundaries that are crossed. The Nephilim has a movement of, there are boundaries. You can create as much beauty as you want, and you can be as desirable as you want, but somehow there's a notion of borders that has to remain. If we cross certain borders, if we go over a certain something, which is not explicit in the text, but then it becomes the problem. But the word Nephilim, as you said, is of course very difficult because we don't really know. Now the Lord regretted what he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth all the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the bird, and the creature that moves along the ground, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The story is never over. Okay? Everything is meant to be destroyed. The Eternal has decided that he had made a mistake in created human beings, because even though they do things beautiful, they don't have a sense of the limit. They don't know the limit. And if they don't know the limit, everything is nofel, like the Nephilim. Everything falls. Everything caves in. And the thing is sealed. except that there is one guy who comes. Okay, so the first story that we have, and I'm using this one because it is highly related to the second one, but in an unsuspected way. So this is a global threat, and there's a threat that everything is destroyed. Okay. Now, if you look at the second story, yeah.
One question: how do you enter the freedom concept for the human being in front of God in this state?
The
freedom. Can you put our freedom as human beings in front of God?
Well, I think it's the.
They have a place there.
It definitely does, and I think the place is in the last part of the verse. And Noah found favor. You can be taken by the movement of your generation, and this is going to keep coming back in this whole section, okay, up to the modern text that we're going to look at. Nobody, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of what I want to say, but I say it because you mentioned it, and I prefer just to answer the question now. In all of this picture of a humanity that is running to its downfall, okay, in front of a global crisis, the one criteria that is common to this story and the other one, which is the Tower of Babel, okay, is the emergence of the individual that stands out and say, not me. That's the freedom. So you are taken into the thing, but either you have Noah or you have Abraham. And if you have Abraham, in fact, you have the emergence of monotheism from the story of the Tower of Babel. Because the emergence of monotheism is Genesis 12. The Tower of Babel is Genesis 11. Abraham comes exactly as the only response to the global threat, which is the emergence of an individual who said, I can think differently. So the question for us, of course, is exactly this. Are we going to be swallowed by the movement of a globality? Now, it could be two things. It's either the globality in its sinfulness, or it's the globality in its attempt to prevent the disaster. There are two globalities. Everybody should do the same thing so that the environment crisis is taken. The answer of the Bible is, wait, where is the individual in this? Where is the individual with his freedom who's going to say, I am not part of the globality that is in its sinfulness, and I'm not also part of the globality who's going to think globally about the solution. I am the one who's going to think differently about the solution. And here, there is something, of course, for us, of saying we tend to think about the environmental crisis in global terms. The Bible thinks in individual terms. It pictures a globality either in its downfall or in its attempt at survival. The attempt at survival is the story of the tower. But out of that, what is really interesting is that it is Abraham that emerged. Therefore, monotheism, therefore a rupture with the past. Now, I'll go to the story of the, if it's okay with you, I'll go to the story of the Tower of Babel, and I've put it here, but let me just say, why is this related to the story of the flood? Because it's not so obvious. Anybody knows? Okay, it's global. Yeah, it's global. It's true. Okay. The second level of the relation is that the rabbinic commentary on the text, which I haven't put here, but trust me for it, Rashi and all the others, have done a quick rabbinic calculation about the number of years since the creation of the world to the flood. And so they say, I can't remember, it's 1,600 something years. I can't remember exactly. And then they say, this is what they read in this story, why is the story of the Tower of Babel come? Because this happens the same number of years after. And they said to themselves, every 1,636 years or whatever, God brings a destruction to the world. And God brings a destruction to the world, let's build a tower to support the heaven. Okay? So they read it as a global answer to a global threat, which is interesting because that's where we are. You know, we keep saying we need a global answer to a global threat. I mean, that's kind of the language that we use. So that text suddenly, I think, becomes really interesting when you read in this light, because it has an echo of what we are.
So they said there was another catastrophe that was since the Tower of Babel. But between the Tower of Babel and that time, did they see other catastrophes?
So no, so they said from the creation of the world to the flood, this is the number of years. And those inhabitants say we are almost now the same amount of years after the flood. Therefore, Rashi and the earliest commentator, there is a book that does that. It's called the Seder Olam Rabbah, which is a 2nd century midrashic kind of text, which works the chronology. Okay, it's a really, really interesting one. In particular, because of course it's all fantasy. Okay, it's fantasy chronology, but you can.
Everybody wants to know when is the end of the world.
No, but here we want to know when's the beginning, or when's the destruction. But it's interesting because here it allows for the interpretation of this text in light of the flood story, but it also allows, if you calculate the age of Abraham, to realize that Abraham was part of the builders of the tower. You know, because you can say, who are those idiots who are building a tower as if you can reach to heaven? And then you realize, well, actually, Abraham is one of them. And then suddenly you say, okay, so I can't read it as this is a bunch of idiots. It's not a bunch of idiots, so what is it that they're doing? So somehow the chronology here helps a little bit to take the text a little bit more seriously than we might be tempted to do. Okay? Now, see what's happening in this text. I just read quickly the beginning. Everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a valley in the land of Shinar, and they settled there, so everybody goes to the same place. They said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. Bricks serve them as stones, and bitumen serve them as mortar. And they build the tower. Okay, we know the story, and then God comes down and he's upset. He destroyed the tower and he mixes up the language. What's interesting here is, what is this kind of humanity? What is this globality that is pictured for us? What do they do? First verse. Look at the first verse. Okay, they're all together. They have a common origin. Okay, they all come from Kedem. They all established. So there's this kind of global movement, and it's an indiscriminate us, an indiscriminate we. We do all that together. They all speak the same language. There's this kind of unity. Everybody has the same idea. Everybody uses the same word. There's this kind of homogeneous. There's this kind of homogeneity. And here, it's not a global threat. Here, it's a global response to the global threat. Okay, that's why the link is interesting. But what is a global response where, in its globalness, the words are few? Because if you translate the text, Vayehi kol haaretz safa achat, and it happened that all the earth was one language, udvarim achadim, so the translation here says, and the same words. But you see, achadim is the plural of echad, okay? Which is the same word as achat in the feminine. Achadim, dvarim achadim means just and a few words. Okay, so they had the same language, it just had basically a few words. There's this kind of globality that is going to try to go and achieve infinity, okay? But at the same time, I'm going back to the narrative. Their narrative, their language is completely impoverished because of their globality. Impoverished, meaning that they only speak a few words. They all think the same. There's no voice for dissenting voice. There's no alternative opinions. There's no sophistication of language. It's all very rudimentary. It's very, very monolithic. And the question, of course, here is, what happens to the individual? What happens to the individual when you think globally? Either as a global threat or as a global response to the threat. Is there not a risk when you're looking at globality that somehow what you might lose in the process is the recognition of the value of the individual? So thinking globally has its dangers. There's something that disappears possibly in the process. That's why, as Pacho was asking the question, the issue of Noah and the issue of Abraham as individual suddenly appear in the middle of that global narrative, saying, hey, wait, it's all about the individual. It's not about just the globality. So where, in our thinking about the environment, where is the place of the individual? Yeah.
What about
The Messiah. Yes, I think it is, in the sense that you see, there have been since the 18th century, there has been an interesting discussion within Judaism as to whether or not modern Jews believe in the Messiah, or do we believe in the Messianic age as a concept, right? And they say, well, we don't really believe as a Messiah, as an individual who's going to arrive on his white donkeys on the gate of Jerusalem and so on. But the personified Messiah, of course, is the place of the individual. If not, it's kind of a globality. You know, it's the war of Gog and Magog, and it's all global. It's what we'll see later on, Shmuel Trigano calls the magmatic reality of humanity. When faced, we'll see that in the text in a few minutes, when faced with the globalization, then humanity becomes magmatic, and you are losing the face of the individual in the process. And what he's saying, as we'll see later, is one has to be really, really, really careful when we are indeed facing moment of global threats that might require global response. We have to be extremely careful that at the end there is a place for Noah and there is a place for Abraham. That if you don't do that, then you fall into the magma of a vision of humanity that has erased the face of the individual. And the reason I'm saying this is because if you remember, when we started the seminar on Monday, I said we have to be honest about the way we look at the problem, because are we all really in the same boat? And of course, it is convenient to say we are all in the same boat in front of the crisis of the environment. But the truth is, we are not in the same boat. We are not. You know, so there's a language that says it's a global problem, and there's a reality which is, again, I'm taking the example of Paris. Paris, in front of global warming, is a wonderful city, because it's all open and you're outside with things that you couldn't do when I was a kid. Then suddenly it's like Rome. It's nice. So we are not in the same boat. Ultimately, we might be, not taking that away. That's why it's a complex problem. But in the present, we are not completely in the same boat. Not at all. Okay? So the story here brings this idea of the loss of the individual in front of the process. Now, there's a very famous midrash that I want to mention to you. I didn't bring it as a text, but there's a very famous midrash about what happened to the people of the Tower of Babel. And the midrash says the following: it said, the characteristic of the people of the Tower of Babel is that when they were building the tower, they had people carrying bricks and going up and down the ladders up to the top, and each time there was a brick that was falling and that was broken, they were all in despair of saying, we've lost a brick, we've lost a brick. But when there was an individual that was falling and crashing on the ground, they just carried on as if nothing had happened. The globalness of the effort makes the value of the individual disappear. The individual is nothing. And so the question is, how do we tackle the question of the environment while at the same time remaining sensitive to the question of the environment, of the individual? And the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of the answers we hear about the environment do not take into account the fact that if you don't do this, this whole industry goes pear-shaped. And if this whole industry goes pear-shaped, the people don't have salaries. And the people don't have food. So there is the question of you can't just say we shouldn't do that, or let's just stop doing this because this is damaging for the environment. Of course it does, but at the same time, you can't take away the fact that if you stop doing that, you're condemning the people working to have absolutely no revenue and nothing. So the place of the individual from that point of view has to be a concern. It can't not be a concern. And that's why I think those texts are sort of interesting. Now, the way that works, if you want, is I'll put you here another text. This time we moving on a little bit with time, and we're looking here now at a rabbinic text. Just want to look at the beginning of it. It's something that looks a little bit tricky at the beginning because it's a technical bit, but it's a very good rabbinic example of, no, we're not in the same boat. It's more complicated than that because individuals have different realities, and you can't erase that reality in front of a global threat. So it's about something which is called the smoke of the arrangement. I don't know if you know what that is. We haven't done it for a long, long time. It's something in the temple. Okay, it's that the arrangements of the wood and the incense, and some families were supposed to arrange wood and the incense and put the fire and the smoke. One family in particular was very, very well known that it knew how to make the smoke rise vertically every day, just without any disturbance. Okay? So it's about that. But it says, the Gemara asks, with regard to the smoke of the arrangement, is it so that even if all the winds in the world come and blow it, they do not move it from its place and it raises directly heavenward? Because there's this family who knows how to make the smoke goes exactly straight up. Didn't someone called Rabbi Yitzchak Baravdimi said the following? So the Gemara is bringing a contradiction. It says, it's ridiculous, it's not true. You can't do that. There's wind and, it's not. Okay. So he said, look, at the conclusion of the final day of the festival of Sukkot, okay, in the Bible, the festival of tabernacles, everyone looked to the smoke of the arrangement of wood. If the wind blew from the south and the smoke tends towards the north, the poor were glad and the homeowners were sad. This is because it was a sign that all the year's rain would be plentiful, producing an abundant crop on the one hand, but on the other hand, the fruit would rot due to the humidity, rendering it impossible to store the abundant harvest. This forced the landowners to sell quickly at the lower price. The poor were happy, the landowners were sad. And if a northern wind caused the smoke to tend towards the south, the poor were sad and the homeowners were glad because it was an indication that this year's rain would be sparse, the yield would be low, and it would easily be stored and the fruit and sell at a higher price. What is good for the home landowner is not good for the poor, and vice versa. So not everybody is in the same boat. I mean, people have different kinds of needs. People have different jobs. People have different kinds of needs. People have different kinds of means, and so on and so forth. If a western wind caused the smoke to tend to the east, that was an indication that there would be sufficient rainfall to ensure a substantial crop, and at the same time, it would be possible to store the fruit, and everybody was happy. So it does happen that everybody's in the same boat, but it's not always. And if an eastern wind caused the smoke to tend to the west, it was an indication that there would be a drought, because eastern winds do not bring rain, and so everybody was sad. Okay, you have nothing. So, yeah, it does happen, but it doesn't always happen. And the Gemara here, and that's what's remarkable, the Gemara is not condemning the landowners. The Gemara is not saying, landowners, enough with your high revenue. The Gemara only said, that's human life. There are different kinds of people. They react differently to different kinds of events. Sometimes it's better for one, sometimes it's better for the other. There are conditions where sometimes it's kind of more equal than others, but there's no sense of condemnation, which is what I think is interesting in this text, is that somehow it puts us in front of situations in which different things happen, and it benefits or not different kinds of people, and we have to be aware of that. Now, the text that says it even better, in a way, is the following one. I'll put it here. It's from the Mishnah, so this is a little bit earlier, so it's kind of an interesting little passage. This is also about the festival of Sukkot, but now it's about when do you pray for rain? Okay? You have to pray for rain sometime around the festival of Sukkot, and you stop praying for rain sometime around Pesach. But there is a debate exactly when. When do they mention the power of bringing the rain? Rabbi Eliezer said, from the first day of the festival of Sukkot. So after the first day, you introduce the prayer for rain. Rabbi Yeshua says, on the last day of the festival of Sukkot. Why? Because you don't want to ruin the whole festival. No, but okay? Rabbi Joshua said to him, since rain on the festival is nothing but a sign of God's curse, why should you mention it? And Rabbi Eliezer said to him, I also did not say to request the rain, but to make mention of the rain. I mentioned the rain. I didn't say that God should bring it today. I said, I mentioned the rain, but please bring it at the end of the festival. Okay, so a little kind of a thing. He caused the winds to blow and the rain to fall in its due season, and he replied to him, if so, one should make mention of the rain at any time. If you want to say that you mentioned the rain, but you haven't said when you mentioned the rain, but it's for a later period, you could mention rain all year round. So he said that is not an argument that's going anywhere. He then goes on and he says, they don't pray for rain. I'll skip this one. I'll read the third one, sorry. On the third day of Marshevan, which is the month that follows the high holidays in the beginning of the fall in the northern hemisphere, they begin to ask for rain. Rabban Gamliel said, on the 7th, 15 days after the festival of Sukkot, and this is the fascinating answer, so that the last of the Jews reaches the river of the Euphrates. Not on the first day of Sukkot, not on the last day of Sukkot, okay? On the 15 days after the festival of Sukkot, I mentioned rain, so that the last Jews who came to Jerusalem from Babylon have a chance to return safe at home and are not trapped into the rain as they travel. And you see, the text here is interesting because it has this tension between the common good and the individual. To look at the common good without making due process and space for the place of the individual is risky. Waiting for the individual is also risky, of course. But the Mishnah here only points, I think, to the fact that at least let's be aware of that tension rather than just simplify the process. And you remember on the first day, or the first day, I think, of the seminar, I said that for me, what's interesting is to bring shadows into the problematic that we're looking at through those texts, to bring complexity rather than just to state the obvious. To state the obvious, to state that there is a crisis, to state that we need a global answer, all that is obvious, we know. But there are shadows to that. And I think religious thinking has this capacity to manage the shadows and not be afraid of mentioning them. So do we wait for the last one to have reached home before we pray for rain, even though that might have an impact on the people who are waiting for rain in Jerusalem? That's another 2 weeks with no rain. So there's this kind of teaching here that's there. So all that to come to the text of Trigano, which is an interesting passage. We're going to start it here, and you'll see. I mean, the English is not very good, but it's me who has the book is in French. After the flood. So I just want to read a few paragraphs here. After the flood, which saw the mass disappearance of humanity, the survivors fall again by erecting the Tower of Babel. So we saw the two narratives. Beyond the legendary metaphor, what does the biblical narrator teaches us? The flood had overwhelmed a humanity that had failed to safeguard the distinction, and this is the Nephilim and the falling and the different things, okay? The distinction mixing in sexuality, the human with the animal, the human with himself, the human with the divine, it's all mixed up, okay? It's a loss, it's a loosening of the boundaries. It is this humanity that has had masked in the confusion of gender and sexes that the flood swallowed up, and it is what remains of it that find its own unity in the totalitarian project of Babel that the one God will come to separate again. There's a totalitarian project to rescue. And this is why the link between Babel and the flood is important. But it is totalitarian. They all speak the same language. They all have the same thoughts. When someone dies, as the Midrash says, nobody cares. The only thing that's important is that the bricks arrive at the top. And you will remember in the passage from the Tower of Babel, they're using bricks as mortar. It's always a replacement society. I don't have enough of that, so I'm going to use this in order to compensate. It's this kind of replacement technology. These two successive failures of humanity share the same characteristic: magmatic massification. That's the term that he wants to use. Magmatic massification. The generation of the flood, just like the generation of Babel, annihilates the individual face of people, the very principle of the separation of the beings that make them what they are, distinct from nature, distinct from the divine, and from their fellow man. The two generations cancel out the very possibility of otherness and of language. And it is all humanity together that knows the same destiny, runs the same danger, all the people, all the inhabitants of the planet, all at the same time. And I said, that might happen, but it's very rare, and it is very dangerous, not just because of the threat, because of the other threat that lies behind. These are exceptional situations, he writes. It is very rare indeed for human destiny to be played out so globally across geographical spaces, political situation, and the difference of civilizations. Very, very rare. We are undoubtedly living, so he's not naive, we are living in such a time. And if he had written at the time of COVID, he would have said the same thing. Here's another kind of a global situation. We are undoubtedly living in an era of this kind today, an absolutely exceptional situation, not only with regard to the end of the blocks and the unification of the international system of economic market, or even the massification of the human race, but also with regard to the dangers involved. The atomic weapon, the danger of mass epidemic, okay, and the COVID would have fallen into that, the global ecological threat due to problems related to the ozone layers, the terrible climatic consequences felt, okay, the ravage of the cyclones, El Nino, and so on, many conditions that make the destiny of humanity increasingly massive and unique beyond the accepted diversity of people and experiences. Humanity is today in the Tower of Babel of its power. confronted with the global possibility of a flood of a new kind. And just as like Babel, this manifests an illusory unity, okay, but it's an illusion, that stems from the will to power and the functional and impersonal arrangement of individuals, because the brotherhood of Babel is false. This is not a real brotherhood. No man nor is recognized for what he is, but for his usefulness to the construction of the tower. And the construction of the tower is the tool to prevent the catastrophe. That's, of course, what makes the story interesting. In this seemingly united world, the other do not exist. In Babel, as before the flood, man wanted to suppress the principle of separation, the differentiation, and that's why we understand the Nephilim and the sons of God. It's all of that that's being related. And in the last paragraph, that's the last one I want to read here, the separation of humanity into language and therefore into peoples after the destruction of the tower will resolve the project of creation based on multiplicity and differentiation. It's not for nothing that suddenly God decided to mix up everything again. It's an act against the global attitude, the magmatic massification. The multiplicity of language and people must therefore be understood, contrary to common sense, as the blessing rather than the curse. Today, globalization holds on to us the possibility of a unified humanity, of the ends of borders separating people, of the similarity of their way of life, of a Babylonian type of brotherhoods and bonds that we know hides the germ of destruction and the will to power beyond the deceptive mask. This fraternity cannot implement the hope of peace, but it could more surely bring about violence. Those who will succeed, and this is where it becomes interesting for us, those who will succeed in distinguishing themselves will be the Abraham of tomorrow. Somehow, this is what the situation of global threat and global action to solve a global problem creates. Do we have people who emerge as Abraham? Do we have thoughts that emerge as radical as the creation of monotheism? This is the cradle of monotheism. It's when humanity was engulfed in this global threat and global solution that somehow there's someone who stands up and who say, wait, there's another way. So the call is nothing else than saying, in front of our global threat, the one that we know, what we are looking for is an idea akin to the invention of monotheism. That's as radical as that. And I think that's kind of what makes that text so interesting. This is the Abraham of tomorrow. It is in the face of such experience of massification that monotheism was established. And this is why we detect in the desolate landscape the germs of a new Genesis, much more than the pending apocalypse. If humanity can invent the Tower of Babel, it can also create Abraham. So there's a strong message of hope in the text of things, but there's a strong message of warning against this magmatic massification of humanity when we keep thinking globally. And the challenge is, of course, we need to think globally, but we need to have a global thinking that doesn't fall into the pit of the Tower of Babel, that doesn't reduce the language to just a few words, where everybody says the same thing, and if you don't say the same thing, you don't have a voice to the chapter. And we need here, this is not a call for having people who are kind of skeptic and just for the sake of it, they make this skeptical argument. This is the call for something that we haven't seen. Of saying someone needs to come with a new monotheistic approach, as radical as that. Okay, so, are we all in the same boat? As I kind of title this this idea, is something which I think here is kind of well put, if you want, by someone like what's his name? Trigano, by Shmuel Trigano. Okay. So what I want to turn to, just to kind of finish with a few more texts, the last part is, once we understand all that, so we might understand that we need a controlled dominion, that getting rid of dominion, moving away from ethnocentrism, is not necessarily without its risks. And maybe if we want to keep the sense of responsibility, or if we want to keep the sense of freedom, then somehow some sort of power and dominion is needed as long as it's controlled. So if we keep all this idea in mind, if we keep in mind this idea that amidst the global reality of the environment issues, we need to make space to have voices of Abraham emerging, new voices of Abraham emerging, as radical as that, comes the question as, how do we listen? Or do we just say, when someone comes up with something a bit different, we just say they're complete crazies? Okay, because there's such an overwhelming discourse. And again, here I am not proposing, just to be clear, I am not proposing the alternative as the ecologically skeptic people in the US in particular. I mean, this is not at all my point. You've understood that. I'm just saying that out of this global thing, there's still a need for someone who says something different. But once we hear something different, what makes it that we listen? Okay, so this is what I wanted to call eco-prophecy. Who are the prophets, after all, who are going to say something that I haven't heard? We've heard a lot of things about the environment. Who's going to say something I haven't heard? And how will I listen? One, to the voice, and two, what would be required for me to act upon that voice? So in other words, not just to listen, but to act, meaning feeling a sense of duty, feeling a sense of obligation. And I'm interested into this question because technically Judaism is a religion of commandments. It's a religion where we should have a sensitivity to, we are commanded to do a certain number of things. We've been trained to be commanded to do a certain number of things. How do I reignite the sense of duty and move it beyond the sphere of Judaism? Because if it stays within Judaism, it's completely useless because we're a very tiny group and so we make no difference. Okay, so I want to start with this little text. It's very well known, but it's really difficult. And fair enough, we won't have time to read all of it, but okay. It's called Prophecy with Fools and Children. And the idea is that since the destruction of the temple, prophecy, since the destruction of the temple, even since the return from the first exile, prophecy has ceased in Israel. But the Talmud comes and said, well, yes, prophecy has ceased in Israel, but if you still want to listen to prophets, listen to fools and listen to children. They still have something to tell you, but can we listen? Can we listen to them? And here's the example that it gives. Rabbi Yochanan said, it's a bit of a complicated text, so just be careful because there's lots of names. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan said, from the day the temple was destroyed, prophecy was taken from the prophets and given to fools and children. To children, we kind of understand more easily. To fools, it's a bit more challenging to a certain degree. But maybe it's more fun. In what way is prophecy given to fools? Asked the Talmud. It was like this incident which involved someone called Mar Bar Rav. Okay, you can already tell by the name that there's something iffy going on. Okay, it's called Mar Bar Rav. Okay, Baravashi, who was standing in the street of a place called Mechodza, when he heard a certain fool saying, the head of the religious academy, the yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, who will be appointed in Mata Mechasya, usually sign his name of saying Tavyume. So, there's different kinds of things, okay? So there's this guy, he meets a fool. Mar barav ashi meets a fool in a particular place. And in this place, the fool says to him, the one who will be appointed as the head of the yeshiva in this other place, I don't know his name, but he signs as someone who is called Tavyume. Tavyume means the kind of Tovyum, the day is good. Okay, it's kind of a bit of a nonsense of a term, right? Mar barav ashi said to himself, who among the sages signed his name Tavyumye? Nobody but me. I'm the only one who is just like, this is the nickname I use for myself. Okay? So he said, okay, it's gonna have to be me. Conclude from the statement by the fool that my hour has arrived, so I'm gonna be the head of the academy. And I will reap success in this matter. He arose and went to this other city where he's supposed to become the head. By the time he arrived, the sages had already decided to appoint someone else, called Rav Acha of Difti, as the head of the yeshiva. Because, of course, the first one wasn't there. He's in another city. But suddenly he arrives, and the sages are here and say, well, we've appointed you already. There's a great scholar who's just arriving. So they said, that's the next passage, as soon as the sage heard that Mar barav ashi has arrived, they determined not to proceed with their political appointment without the approval of such an important figure. Okay, so this great sage arrived and said, okay, well, listen, I mean, we've decided to appoint you, but hold on, we can't do without his opinion. We really need to ask him. They sent a pair of sages to him to consult with him, and he detained them. He, meaning this wonderful sage, heard about the fact that they had appointed someone else, and what did he do? He wants the power, he puts them in his cupboard, and he locks the key, and he throws the keys away, okay? They again sent another pair of sages to him, and he detained them as well. They continue until they completed the quorum of 10 sages. Once they reached 10 men, Mar barav ashi opened his lecture, taught, and expounded. He did not speak earlier, because one should not speak in a lecture during a rabbinic assembly, a kala, the gathering for Torah study during the month of Elul and Adar, when less than 10 men are present. He was then appointed as head of the yeshiva. So you see what they did. He took 2 guys, put them in prison, in his cellar, then 2 more guys, put them there, until 5 times, until he got 10. When he got 10, he opens the door, and basically he said, who votes for me? And they're 10, and if they're 10, it's valid, and he becomes the head of the yeshiva. And so the story said that, it ends with this, understanding that he had been passed over for the position. Rav Acha of Difti read about himself in rabbinic aphorism, anyone who is treated poorly will not soon be treated well, and anyone who is treated well will not soon be treated poorly, and so on and so forth. What is interesting in this is, in what way is that a prophecy you want to listen to? Here's a fool who's telling complete rubbish. But it happens. Why would we have listened to this fool? You see, you're outside of normal prophecy here. There's no rabbinic teaching in this. There's no Torah teaching. This is just a fool on the street who just said, this is what's supposed to happen. This is what will happen. Do we need to go by the norms of prophecy in order to listen to prophecy? Or can we bypass the norm and say, listen, there is something, and I don't know why you've said that, but there is something that's kind of unfolding. So there's a prophecy, and what makes the prophecy real is that it's the unfolding of the prophecy. It's not the message of the prophecy. It's not the structure of the prophecy. It's not the content of the prophecy. It's not the method of the prophecy. But nevertheless, there is something that is said. Who listens to that? I mean, we tend not to. We tend not to and say, listen, you know nothing about it. You're not a scientist. You know, you're not a renowned thinker. You're not someone who knows about the environment. You've never studied the ozone layer. You've never, you don't have the credentials. And it sounds foolish. You're telling me. So there is something here we're in front of something that is so different than everything that we knew from the norms. Do we have this capacity to go beyond what we expect from the norms? So I think from that point of view, it's a kind of a call to us, to a certain degree, to say, okay, I might have to listen to fools and children. Okay, and there is the same kind of thing with the child. I'm not going to do it just for the sake of time, but there's the same kind of story about the child. What is it that the child said? And again, it's not following any pattern of prophetic speech. And yet the call is to say we should still listen to something that is outside. And if you remember, there's a story, I don't know if you have it in mind, but there's a story like this in the Torah. The story of Eldad and Medad. Does that ring a bell? No? I'll put it for you here. I don't have it as a PDF, but it's Numbers 11. Okay, it's Numbers 11. Let me just get it here. Where's the 11? Oh, here. And Numbers 11, and it's a short story, 26 to 29. It's kind of an interesting little text. Now, that's when the children of Israel are in the wilderness. Now 2 men remain in the camp, one named Eldad, the other named Medad, and the Spirit rested upon them, so they're prophesying. They were among those registered, but they had not gone out to the tent, and so they prophesied in the camp. So all the other prophets had gone out, and they stayed behind. A young man ran to Moses and said, Eldad and Medad are prophesying in the camp, which they shouldn't do, they should do outside. And Joshua, the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses, so here's the hierarchy of the establishment, okay, that comes. And Joshua said, the son of Nun, the assistant of Moses from his youth, said, oh, my Lord, Moses, stop them. It's terrifying. There are people who are prophets, but they're not doing it as they should. They're not doing it the right way. Stop them. Moses said to him, are you jealous for my sake? Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them? And Moses and the elder in Israel returned to the camp to listen to what the prophets, who are not really the real prophets because they haven't followed the whole school of prophecy, and they don't have all the diplomas of the prophet, and they don't speak where the prophets are supposed to speak, not with the words of the prophet. And Joshua, as the regulator, says, listen, stop them. I mean, this is ridiculous. They talk nonsense. So this idea that there's a prophecy, outside of what we expect to be the standard prophecy, is something that is really important. And it's something that is important to us, because if we are facing such a problem for which we don't have a knowledge from the past about ecological and environmental crisis, we don't have the biblical knowledge about it. So it's not going to work with quotes. It's not going to work with things that we've seen. It's going to have to be something different. Something new, maybe something we think is from fools and from children. But do we have that capacity to listen? So that's the thing. And what I want to finish with, I won't read the text because it's too long, but I just want to tell you what it is and to explain to you just a little bit in the last few minutes. I'll put it here so you know what it is. It's a text from someone called Eugene Borovitz. Eugene Borovitz died a few years back. He was an American rabbi. And he wrote a book which is called Renewing the Covenant. Renewing the Covenant. Very well-known book of kind of, it's the closest you get to real theology from a non-Jewish point of view, but written by a Jew for the Jewish community. And he points out to the following difficulty. He says, since the time of the emancipation, the Jews have lost the sense of duty. Because whatever happened in history, the one thing that Jews have kept is the sense of the emancipation of the self. He said, from the time of the Enlightenment, the emancipation of the self has been something that the Jews have cherished over and over again. And by that he means there is no Jew today, either, I'm excluding the super ultra-Orthodox, but from the vast, vast majority of the Jewish landscape. There is no Jew today who will perform a commandment if it doesn't go through the filter of the self. In other words, somehow it has to make some sense for me. Okay. Which is very far away from the notion of commandment, because the notion of commandment has nothing to do with the self. So he's struggling with the question of, if we want to preserve Judaism, and if we want to preserve something of the Jewish community and the knowledge of the Jewish community, we need to reintroduce what he calls a robust, that's what you have on the screen here. We should arrive at a theory of robust Jewish duty. If we don't reintroduce the sense of what it means to be commended, there is no more Judaism for the future. Now, I'm taking this as a kind of an interesting entry point into whatever the analysis we have of the environment and what needs to be done. If we don't have, and here I'm moving outside of the Jewish community, of course, in the global sense, if we don't have a sense of being commended to do a certain number of things in order to stop the massacre, if you want, then it's going to go nowhere. So how do we create in our society, how do we recreate a sense of being commended, a sense of duty? If we bypass that question, we're just going to talk. But at the end of the day, it's all going to be about the self, and everything is going to be about the self, and at the end of the day, nobody will do anything. Okay? So how to feel that one is commended, and this is what he's trying to deal with. And one of the interesting things that he says, I mean, I'm really summarizing much, much too fast, but okay. He's saying the notion of covenant is interesting, because covenant is something that creates that notion of duty, but that keeps boundaries without one collapsing into the other. They are humans and they are God. They belong to different categories. It is not ethnocentric and it is not God-centric. It's the question of the relationship between the two. And what he says, so he doesn't talk about the environment, but he talks about this notion of covenant as, why is the notion of covenant an important one to talk about this notion of duty? And he explores that view. And he says, in order to get the sense of duty into the notion of covenant, you need to go through an election. You need to feel special. You need to feel that this is not just global for everybody. That doesn't create a sense of duty. What creates a sense of duty is that amongst the global, there is a covenant between two different entities, God and a people, which are specific and which are reduced and which are in a privileged situation. That movement from the global to the privilege, with two partners of unequal value, creates what is needed for the sense of duty to function. And the idea I have about this is that somehow what's interesting is it's neither God-centric nor ethnocentric. And in that sense, it's kind of similar to what we do if you replace God by nature. It's not so dissimilar. It's in the sense that it proposes a partnership, a covenant between human and nature, which doesn't give away ethnocentrism, which doesn't go to ecocentrism either. So the tension is remain between the two. But what is missing is, what is this election of a smaller group who can create the sense of duty before it can dispatch the sense of duty to the wider group after. But his explanation is that you need to go through the process of election to be able to then have a more global perception. But without the sense of being chosen, there is no sense of duty. So how do we translate that? And I don't know the answer. But I think that text, if I were to recommend that you could read that text and just think about it, I think this is a text really to think about the last few pages of this of the passage that is here, because here there is a metaphor, a theological metaphor that could be applied to the question of the environment. But what's this smaller group that would be in a position of covenantal relationship that could re-implement and regenerate the notion of duty, which is a notion that we need if we want to do something about the crisis, because otherwise it's just talk and not sufficient. So I think this text to me is opening an interesting door, which I don't know how to work it out. I really don't know what it would be, but I think this is a road that is very rarely explored, in that of the covenant and that of the sense of duty, the relationship between the two, and the doing, which becomes something that's kind of important. So anyhow, I've summed up the text very, very quickly. We didn't even read it, but at least you have it in the document if you want. And I think with that, I'll just bring it to a sort of a closure. So thank you very much, everybody.